Hi, this is Pilleater, and I'd like to talk about the myth of the gamemaster-less role-playing game. First, how can you have a game without a game master? Not talking about RPGs for a minute, but with any board, card, physical games in general, someone has to act as the host in order to execute the game. That is, tell the orders, how to play, correct misplay, until everyone becomes their own player knowing the rules without asking the game master or the rulebook. And in a way, the rulebook acts as a fake game master if no one knows how to play a board game. So a game masterless game, that's not a role-playing game, but a board card game in general, would describe most games if everyone already knows how to play. You don't really need a game master to describe a game because the game master becomes one with the game. But according to a game masterless role-playing game in that genre, it refers to a role-playing game where everyone is role-playing, but everyone is the judge, referee on the limits of the game. Now, this is the unfortunate part, and it could cause many problems, right? I think this would be best described by a quote by Frank Mentzer in the Basic Rule Set 1 of Basic Dungeons & Dragons from 1983. And on page 8, after you do the Choose Your Own Adventure part of the Learn to Play guide, he says something very interesting. So he writes, "You have just played a D&D game. This adventure was designed to show you some of the basic parts of the game. You played a fighter who tried to survive in the dungeon while finding monsters and treasures. You succeeded, so your character wins. Think a moment. Why do we play games? To have fun." Now, keep in mind, Mentzer is talking about the fun cliche, which I can debunk in another screencast. But continuing, each player wins by having fun, so if you had a good time, you win. You can have fun even if your character gets killed, and that happens. Don't worry, you can always make up another one. Winning a role-playing game is like winning in real life. It just succeeds in doing what you want it to do and living through it. The fun comes from doing it, not ending it. This is why we say that in this game. Everybody wins and nobody loses. And then so why play this game then? But is this a game or a story, you ask? It's a little of both. As you learn more about it, it will become more and more like a game. You still have many game details to learn. So continue reading. You have met some monsters and you won the battles. You have found some treasures, not only coins and gems, but a magical potion. Most important, you have learned how to use your own imagination while using the rules of the game. Can you see in your mind the wicked magic users Bargle? Or the kind, wise cleric Alina? Can you imagine the gold and silver scattered on the floor by the huge, deadly rattlesnake and the fierce battle afterward? This is another part of fun in the Dungeons & Dragons game. And so Mentzer references that it's only a game when you have more rules to it. So we must ask, is a story a byproduct of the dice game, that's BECMI D&D, being played, the game? Or is it a never-ending story with random outcomes and choices? A story. And for another set of examples, is it a game where there is challenges, limits, resources, competition, cooperation, science, and results and success and failure? A game. Or is it a storytelling game where dice actually determine paths, not math? Without an end? And that's also a story. And so Mentzer relates that it only becomes a game once you add more rules to it. Kind of like this weird allegory for life. And this asks a bigger question. Do components limit a game, role-playing game's freedom? Yes, they do, but how so? Compare such games like Gloomhaven, Space Hulk to basic Dungeons & Dragons. Gloomhaven has a lot of components. It's a big box and expensive game. There's heavy components in it. And you can't do everything in Gloomhaven, like have sex with a prostitute or murder your best friend. You can't do that. Components limit that. You have to deal cards from a deck, or you have to go around a board. It has heavy components and abides by the component physical world. Now in the middle you have Space Hulk. Space Hulk is a game system, but gives you everything you need to play, like 22-something Gene Stealers, a modular board, the Space Marine team. Now you can use your own miniatures. You can use your own board. You can use the system and not use any of the Space Hulk components. So it's a very minimal setup. It's ready to play out of the box, but you can pretty much take the system and make a variation of it and make something new out of it. And people have already done that with Space Hulk. And so minimal components is modular in nature, meaning you can always extend it with expansions. And now Basic Dungeons & Dragons from 1977, John Eric Holmes rules, there's nothing. Tells you to get a piece of paper, pencil, dice, and graph paper, but the game doesn't come with it. It tells you to do it on your own. And so you're really left in a wild with that. So from left to right, we have heavy, minimal, and nothing. And as Mentzer says that it's a story if there's nothing to it and you're just storytelling. But once you have the most components, like on Gloomhaven's side, then it becomes really a game. And it depends how much components or limits you want. Components being physical and the limits being of imagination. So how did this game master-less craze happen? Likely around the 2000s and into the SJW safe space teens. We could talk about many games, but I think these games are important. We first had something of the shifting game master games, where you had a game master in it, but everyone would have a turn at being the game master. One of my favorites is Bullwinkle and Rocky, the role-playing party game by Dave Zeb Cook and Warren Spector. In every other turn, everyone gets to have the choice of being the narrator or game master in a single play. And there's often an outcome between winning and losing, just like any other ordinary games. I mean, you can hypothetically play it as the life allegory, as Mentzer says about winning and losing in life. And depending, it's just a fun party game, if you want it to be a party. And on the right, we have Ars Magica by Jonathan Tweet, who's a Marxist atheist. And Ars Magica is more for the serious type of person. But in Ars Magica, everyone gets to have the chance to play the Game Master, but more in terms of Advanced Dungeons & Dragons and things like that, ever since 3rd edition. And you could be more serious with Ars Magica compared to the party nature of Rocky and Bullwinkle. So we see this kind of trend happening where everybody wants a turn at being the Game Master and things could go any directions. You don't need set modules, or the game of designing games becomes the games that are being designed are more party games, but turning more sincere in general. And then you have something of the creation of a robot aid, the Mythic Game Master emulator, which stems from the Mythic role-playing game. And this is an aid used to play other role-playing games by oneself as solos or group experiments. Maybe you're a loner and you just want to make a game book out of everything, so you use the Game Master emulator to make choices. Or that you're with a group and you don't have anything set up, and so you're learning from this book and kind of like using a rule book from any other board game you would play and relying on the Mythic Game Master emulator to do it. I mean, most people who buy modern board games today who don't know, they learn the rules through the rule book, and if there's anything suspicious with activity or minor questions, they look at the rule book. And this is what Mythic Game Master emulator does for role-playing games. No longer do we rely on the game master who has to design games, but a book itself. But again, as said before, the irony is there is a game master that presents these rules, so it's impossible to have a game masterless role-playing game or game masterless game. And then it became more about storytelling. You had old card game like Once Upon a Time and Story Cubes, which came in the 2000s, where you're telling a story. Now there's another card game called Man Bites Dog, not pictured here. That's more like a Weekly World News variant spin-off. But the point is that you're telling a story, and there's no win or lose conditions to storytelling. You tell a story, and it can be anything from an outrageous brain freeze creativity storm to something more logical and experimental. But these games give you too much freedom, and it really is this kind of drug of, if it's all about fun, well, You might as well smoke weed and listen to Led Zeppelin. And so you're creating now these random, outcomes with everything. Personally, I don't like Once Upon a Time because the whole rule book is written as her, not he. They're anti-white male. But anyway, getting to the popular gamemaster-less games, we have Untold Adventure Awaits and Fiasco. Now, Untold Adventures Await is just the story cubes, but built with a system of mechanics that you can use. Untold Adventure uses a set of cards, and it's only just used to get this complicated and sophisticated story out, but the mechanics are sophisticated, but the story comes out minimal. So my big question at Untold Adventures Await is, why use all this when you could just use a table to resolve things, right? And the same is said with Fiasco. Fiasco in 2009 had a guideline, and so you rolled a bunch of D6s to come out random outcomes to write your own little film noir drama, right? But it seems like this random generation is literally just rolling dice and then making sense of it and talking about it. And so, again, it's becoming more for creative writers, not so much of game players. It's a mechanic of its own. And into direct POZness, you get shock, social science fiction. And this one has to be the big enemy on the list because shock writes everything as they and zer without him and her. And of course, shock tries to be a pretentious trick, a big preening political message like Depression Quest by Zoe Quinn. And shock wants you to talk about serious issues now. All right, the irony is if you're playing a game for fun, how can this game be about fun if you're talking about serious issues? It sounds like I went into the Crawton T Discord server and now we're talking about if anarchist capitalism will work. Is that a game in itself? I don't know now. This seems like it's some crazy postmodernism trying to say all truth is relative. And this is exactly the problem. It seems like mentally retarded or socially retarded people can only talk about big issues by playing shock. Why would you even do this in the first place? Now that you don't have any game master anymore, you don't have a patriarch, you don't have the bourgeois class, it's just a bunch of proletariat talking about nothing. How is that a game? But you start to notice something here. And as we looked at the previous games before, they are just board games not in boxes. So if they're just not in boxes, why not play Talisman, which is in a box? Talisman is a fantasy board game where it's on a Parcheesi Candyland board, and you just roll dice 1 to 6, and you really only have the option of going left or right, and then there's a random outcome through random battles, and you just watch the game evolve, kind of like the game of life itself. And so the previous games I mentioned, and if you're telling stories, it can just be a game with components in the box. These game master role-playing games like Fiasco. Why wasn't Fiasco in a box with components like Untold Adventures? Was it just target audience? And exactly it was. Speaking of Fiasco, there's another product called Writer Bloxx. And this is a product for writers, not gamers. However, it can be used to generate stories like from Story Cubes or Mythic, and it's just a brainstorm tool. And you start to understand this, and you get it out, and you roll a dice, and be like, it takes place in a forest, and a goblin's attacking you, and you roll a bunch of d20s. Well, wasn't that the other stories doing that before? It seems like everything's now in a box, and I'm just looking at tables. Again, why did they give me a product, a Fiasco product, that's just a rule book, and I have to get myself all these components? It seems like Writer Bloxx, the only components are dice, and it's my imagination, right? So really, it's just a targeting of something bigger. And I think the whole social thing in Fiasco, it's coming from something called a psychodrama. And a psychodrama, this is a screen cap from the Wikipedia page. A psychodrama is an action method often used in psychotherapy in which clients use spontaneous dramatization, role-playing, and dramatic self-representation to investigate and gain insight of their lives. A lot of people who smoke weed or want to get high use the argument of saying getting high to get insight or wisdom or find some sort of ecstasy in life. Well, that's what the psychodrama does. And of course, Fiasco and Shock are arguing that it's a game, right? But it more acts like a psychodrama, which isn't a game, but a method used by psychologists and academics to gain insight of something greater. If I was to write about a novel that I moved to Manhattan and had a Korean girlfriend and got my cartoon published from Cartoon Network and I acted out in a book, that's a psychodrama. And it's weird because these weird blue-haired cat lady escapist nerds are trying to make sense of it in games. And we're really talking about this battle, this consumer battle, and people not knowing their definitions and limits. But I would like to point out that there's another strange game masterless game that really isn't a game masterless game. And this was on a list of so-called GM-less games, and that was Lexicon. And Lexicon is a computer-assisted role-playing game and popularized by the so-called indie role-playing community, which, by the way, means anyone can do it, and it's just this obsession with stories, not games. As originally proposed, it played online using wiki software. Players assume the roles of scholars who write the history and background of a particular fictitious time, setting, or incident. As the game goes on, the players collaboratively create an elaborate interwoven account. Kind of like that bogus ideal of collaborative script writing, right? And so what you're really doing is, are you really role-playing, or are you playing a creative writing assignment where you get on Wikipedia and finish a lexicon note about an old world or something? It's kind of like Mad Libs. And so how can this really be a game, a role-playing game? Because, again, everybody can edit Wikipedia. And then when you slowly put down rules and say, all right, this is a Wikipedia for people who want to play Lexicon, if that's really a thing, or this was just some social experiment. 26 turns to write down everything. I feel like I can do that with a piece of paper and pass it around. I've already did that in creative writing classes years ago. And yet people want to go on this platform and play Lexicon like that, like if there's going to be some Lexicon passionate people. So this isn't really a game masterless game. This is just what people do anyway. So why even talk about a thing called a game masterless game if you're really just obsessed with the mechanic of role-playing? So Talisman, Writer Bloxx, the Psychodrama, and Lexicon are great rebuttals against game masterless RPGs. It turns out game masterless role-playing games are just role-playing games targeted towards nerdy gamers who already played enough Dungeons & Dragons and want to focus more on the role-playing mechanic. Game masterless role-playing games are normal board card games. The interest in freedom is what motivates the category. Why have it labeled as a game masterless game, role-playing game, when you know it's wrong to say that? Game masters are everyone. And so if I bring out my board game, and you don't know how to play it, I'm a game master in itself. And this label is just referring to people who already like role-playing games and want to be invested in it. And so eventually there is this ultimate problem if we keep using the term game masterless RPGs, right? The obsession with role-playing. So an interest in improvising, storytelling, and theater creates the Brad Pitt Club, like in Fight Club. How can gamers be like this? They are not actors, or Tyler Durden for that matter. In Fight Club, he was acting a fictitious role, as if people who are going to be obsessed now with GM-less games are going to start their own Brad Pitt Club, or in Fight Club, and have these roles. That's not about gaming anymore. I don't think Bobby Fischer wants to act like Tyler Durden. Again, and this goes with the great argument that games are not stories. And your obsession with stories is more in line with improvisation and theater. And by the way, improv is something stuff white people like in Christian Lander's book, Stuff White People Like. And so we have to separate these things. And so why are these popular, and why is it attracting such bad normies? or just weird people who don't understand anything in different cultures. I think it only can be explained as a language game. And a language game is something Ludwig Wittgenstein made up, or put in philosophical investigations. And you use language and the way that language is shown, such as if you say, God exists, you believe in God, and therefore sets you up to believe that God is real. The language you use, whether you call someone a racist or a fascist, someone already has to know the context of how that's ethically wrong, right? And the language games, that's what you could say about these so-called nerds who are into GM-less role-playing games, as they're really into this language game. They're into this ironic, postmodern bullshit that's happening and really destroying uneducated, stupid Gen X millennials. They don't have principles, and they are creating a language game in itself, and through enough education, they'll realize what I've just explained in the past slides before. I'm not an actor, and I'm certainly not a theater, storytelling, or acting major, and I don't think those things belong in games. You can use it as a cosmetic, but that itself is not a game. So you have to separate the mainline writer Cat Lady Club from the nerdy antisocial board gamers. They might overlap because they are both decadent people. However, this might just be nerds who can't talk right, so they have to play a language game in order to socialize, right? So they can't. Smart people just do Chad things and do it. They don't roll dice if they want to greet someone or talk about personal issues. You just say, I divorced my wife recently. Gamers play games. Storytellers tell stories. Add components and rules, games can be formed. It's hard to tell the language game reality from an actual game. This is exactly what Frank Mentzer wrote in the beginning of the Dungeons & Dragons basic rule set. That once you add these components and spaces, you make it more into a board game. So the biggest fraud of a gamemaster-less game is basically you say you would rather play Dungeons & Dragons more acting, improvisation, and storytelling. And that deserves its own category. It should not be this so-called progressive motivation or something new. People have been doing it forever. Whether you introduce a new game to someone, you cannot separate the game master from the game. There are always and will be a game master in a game. Thanks for listening. www.pilleater.com